I need to tell you about the transmissions, about the patterns I didn't see until it was far too late, until half the Imperium had already turned, and I'd helped make it possible. My name is Adept Secundus Cale Threnody, and I was a cipher clerk in the Departamento Munitorum Communications Division aboard the Expeditionary Fleet Command Vessel Eternal Mandate. For 3 years I processed classified military communications, routing orders and intelligence reports between commanders scattered across a dozen sectors, and I never once questioned what I was seeing because everything had the proper authorization codes, the correct clearances, the requisite seals and signatures that made them legitimate. I was good at my job. I was efficient, thorough, completely trustworthy. That's why they chose me. That's why I was perfect for what they needed. The fleet was massive, one of the Great Crusade's primary expeditionary forces pushing into the galactic fringe, reclaiming human worlds that had been lost during Old Night and bringing them back into Imperial compliance. 30 capital ships, hundreds of escorts, support vessels, troop transports, supply haulers, a self-contained military apparatus capable of conquering entire star systems. The command structure was Byzantine in its complexity, with multiple overlapping chains of authority, redundant communication protocols, and enough bureaucratic layers that no single person could see the complete operational picture. That was intentional, I learned later. That was part of the design. If everyone only saw their own small piece of the machine, no one could understand what the machine was actually building. My station was in the communications archive, 7 decks below the command spire, a windowless chamber filled with cogitator banks and Vox relay equipment, where a staff of 200 cipher clerks processed approximately 40,000 transmissions per standard day. We worked in shifts around the chronometer, never sleeping at the same time, never leaving the archive unmanned, because military communications couldn't afford gaps or delays. Lives depended on us routing messages correctly, quickly, without error. An order delayed by even an hour could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat, between a regiment surviving or being annihilated because reinforcements arrived too late. I remember my first day clearly, the way you remember the moment before falling off a cliff, when you're still standing on solid ground and everything seems normal. Senior Adept Vertain gave me my initial briefing, walking me through the classification system, explaining how different clearance levels required different routing protocols, teaching me to recognize the various authorization codes that validated a transmission's authenticity. It seemed straightforward enough. Messages came in through the Vox array. Our cogitators automatically sorted them by priority and classification, and we clerks processed them according to established procedures, forwarding each one to its designated recipient or recipients via the appropriate secure channels. The most important thing, Vertain told me, his augmetic eye clicking as it focused on my face, is that you never read the actual content. You process metadata only: origin point, destination, classification level, authorization codes. The substance of what's being communicated is above your clearance grade and irrelevant to your function. You're a conduit, not an analyst. Understand? Understood, Senior Adept. Good. Because curiosity in this job is a fast route to a bullet in the back of the skull. The commissariat takes information security very seriously, and clerks who try to read classified material they're not authorized for tend to disappear into the brig and never emerge. So you keep your eyes on the routing data, you verify the codes, and you forward the traffic without ever wondering what it says. That's how you survive here. I followed those instructions religiously for my first 3 months, processing thousands of transmissions per shift without ever glancing at their actual content, treating each message as nothing more than an abstract object that needed to be moved from point A to point B via the correct secure channel. The work was tedious but satisfying in its precision, like solving the same puzzle repeatedly, each time with slightly different variables. I developed a rhythm, a flow, moving through my queue with increasing efficiency until I was processing more traffic per hour than any other clerk in my cohort. Vertain noticed my performance, commended me twice in official reports, recommended me for accelerated advancement. That's when I started receiving the special routing assignments. They began appearing in my queue about 4 months into my posting, flagged with a designation I didn't recognize, classification Obsidian, authorization code Serpent 97. The metadata showed they originated from the fleet commander himself, Lord Marshal Valdor Kane, the man who commanded our entire expeditionary force and reported directly to the supreme military authority overseeing the Crusade's Eastern Front. These transmissions had the highest possible clearance level, and the routing instructions were unusual. Instead of going through the normal command channels, they were to be forwarded via a secondary secure network that I'd never used before, one that required special access codes that appeared in my cogitator terminal only when these particular messages arrived. I asked Vertain about it during my next duty rotation. The Obsidian traffic, is this a new protocol? His augmetic eye rotated, focusing on me with uncomfortable intensity. You're asking about content you shouldn't be noticing. I'm asking about routing procedure, Senior Adept. The classification Obsidian messages use a network path I wasn't trained on. I want to verify I'm handling them correctly. He studied me for a long moment, and something moved behind that artificial eye. Something that might have been calculation or might have been wariness. Classification Obsidian is reserved for the most sensitive strategic communications. The secondary network ensures they bypass standard channels where they might be intercepted or compromised. You're handling them correctly if you're following the routing instructions exactly as they appear in your terminal. Don't deviate. Don't question. Don't discuss them with other clerks. Understood? Understood. But I noticed the pattern anyway. Not through deliberate investigation. I wasn't foolish enough to risk a commissariat bullet, but simply because I processed hundreds of these Obsidian transmissions over the following weeks, and certain details accumulated in my awareness, despite my efforts not to see them. The destinations were always high-ranking fleet officers, never common personnel. The transmissions always arrived during specific duty shifts, usually the night rotation when fewer senior staff were actively monitoring the communication flow, and the authorization codes changed in a regular pattern, cycling through a sequence that repeated every 17 days, which seemed oddly specific for a random security protocol. I told myself it meant nothing. Lord Marshal Kane was coordinating sensitive strategic operations. That was all. Of course he'd use secure channels. Of course he'd communicate with his senior officers frequently. Of course the protocols would seem unusual to someone at my clearance level because I didn't have the context to understand them. This was exactly the kind of pattern-seeking that Vertain had warned me against, the curiosity that got clerks disappeared. I needed to stop noticing, stop thinking, just process the routing, and move on. But then the destinations started expanding. After 6 months, the Obsidian traffic wasn't just going to our own fleet officers anymore. I was routing transmissions to commanders in other expeditionary forces, to garrison commanders on worlds we'd already brought into compliance, to administrative officers in the rear logistics chain, to officials scattered across a vast swath of Imperial space. The network was growing, spreading outward like a web, with our fleet at its center, and the volume of traffic was increasing exponentially. What had started as maybe 10 messages per shift had grown to 50, then 100, then more than I could accurately count, because they flooded my queue in waves that required my complete attention just to process correctly. Something was being coordinated. Something large enough to require constant communication between hundreds of high-ranking officials across multiple sectors. And I was facilitating it, routing every single transmission, maintaining the network that made it possible. I should have reported it. I should have flagged the unusual pattern for review by the commissariat or the fleet's intelligence officer, but I had no evidence of wrongdoing, just a vague unease about the scale and scope of communications that were all properly authorized, all carrying correct clearance codes, all originating from the fleet's supreme commander. What would I report? That Lord Marshal Kane was communicating with his subordinates, that classified military transmissions were being routed through secure channels, I'd sound paranoid, incompetent, or worse, suspicious in a way that might redirect the commissariat's attention toward me, so I stayed quiet. I processed the traffic. I kept the network functioning, and I met Marshal Kane himself, which was when the second hook deployed. The character hook that should have warned me, but instead drew me deeper into complicity. He visited the communications archive during my shift, unannounced, walking through the chamber with an escort of his personal staff, while we clerks continued working at our stations, trying not to stare at the legendary commander who'd brought 17 star systems into Imperial compliance over the past decade. Kane was everything a Lord Marshal should be: tall and commanding, with iron grey hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades of battlefield experience, wearing his uniform with a precision that made it look like ceremonial armor. He spoke to several clerks, asking about their work, their efficiency ratings, their satisfaction with their assignments, playing the role of concerned commander checking on his personnel. When he reached my station, he paused longer than he had with the others. Adept Threnody, yes? Senior Adept Vertain tells me you're the most efficient cipher clerk in the archive. Highest processing rate, lowest error margin, exemplary service. Thank you, Lord Marshal. I kept my eyes on my cogitator screen, uncomfortable with the attention. The obsidian traffic must keep you particularly busy, he said casually, and I felt my heart rate spike because he'd just acknowledged something that was supposed to be invisible, something I wasn't supposed to notice existed. I process all traffic assigned to my queue, Lord Marshal. Classification level is irrelevant to routing procedure. Of course, but I wanted to personally thank you for your discretion. The strategic operations we're coordinating require absolute information security, and clerks like you make that possible. You're maintaining a network that will change the course of the crusade, that will reshape the Imperium itself. I hope you understand how vital your role is. I didn't know what to say to that. The Lord Marshal himself was thanking me for processing transmissions I wasn't supposed to acknowledge existed, telling me I was part of something historically significant, making me feel valued and important in a way that no one at my rank ever felt in the Departamento Munitorum's vast bureaucratic machinery. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt proud. I understand, Lord Marshal. I'll continue to maintain the highest standards. I know you will. He smiled, and it was warm, genuine, the smile of a commander who actually cared about his subordinates rather than viewing them as expendable resources. Keep up the excellent work, Adept. The Imperium needs loyal servants like you. He moved on, continuing his inspection tour, and I returned to my queue with renewed dedication, processing the obsidian traffic with even greater attention to detail because the Lord Marshal himself had told me it mattered, that I was part of something important, that my loyalty was valued. I didn't question why he'd singled me out. I didn't wonder why he'd acknowledged the classified traffic I wasn't supposed to notice. I just felt grateful for the recognition and determined to prove I deserved it. That's how it works, I understand now. That's how you turn someone without them realizing they've been turned. You make them feel valued. You give them purpose. You transform their mundane duty into a secret mission that makes them special, chosen, part of something larger than themselves. And then they'll do anything to maintain that feeling, that sense of importance, even when the evidence starts suggesting they're serving something monstrous. The obsidian traffic continued to expand. By my 9th month aboard the Time's Eternal Mandate Asterisk, I was routing transmissions to officials in nearly 30 sectors, a network so vast that it encompassed approximately 40% of the Crusade's total military and administrative infrastructure. The pattern was meticulous, methodical, like watching an infection spread through an organism, one cell at a time. First it would be a single commander in a given sector, then their immediate subordinates, then the logistics officers who supplied them, then the administrative staff who coordinated between military and civilian authority, each new node in the network carefully selected and systematically integrated. And I was the hub. Every transmission flowed through my terminal. Every connection was maintained by my routing. Every node stayed linked to the central network, because I processed the traffic that kept them synchronized. Other clerks handled different aspects of fleet communications, but the Obsidian traffic was mine exclusively. Vertain had assigned it to me permanently after Kane's visit, removing it from the normal rotation and making me the sole conduit for whatever was being coordinated. I started recognizing individual commanders by their message frequency and routing patterns. There was Naval Commander Harek in the 3rd Fleet, who received Obsidian transmissions at least twice per day and forwarded responses with remarkable speed, suggesting he was deeply engaged with whatever was being planned. There was Governor Militant Tessera on the world of Caldris Prime, whose transmissions showed a similar pattern of rapid engagement. There was Lord Commander Vallon of the 16th Army Group, whose network position made him a secondary hub routing traffic to dozens of subordinate officers across multiple worlds. They were everywhere. The network had grown so large that it effectively paralleled the official command structure, creating a shadow version of imperial military authority that operated through channels I maintained. And the content of these transmissions, which I still couldn't read, which remained encrypted and classified far above my clearance, was clearly something that required this level of secrecy, this elaborate infrastructure of hidden communication. I told myself it was contingency planning, emergency protocols for catastrophic scenarios, preparations for some strategic operation so sensitive that it required this level of compartmentalization. The Crusade faced threats I couldn't imagine at my clearance level: alien empires, traitor colonies, warp anomalies that could destroy entire fleets. Of course, the Supreme Military Command needed secure networks for coordinating responses to these threats. Of course, they couldn't use normal channels where the enemy might intercept them. What I was seeing wasn't sinister. It was necessary. But the third hook deployed during my 13th month, and it changed everything. I was processing a particularly large batch of Obsidian transmissions, routing them to their respective destinations as quickly as my cogitator could validate the codes, when I noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. One of the transmissions had a destination that existed in duplicate 2 different secure terminals registered with the same command authority, one in the official network and one in the Obsidian network. The official terminal belonged to Lord Admiral Heston, commanding officer of the 2nd Battle Fleet. The duplicate terminal showed his Obsidian network designation, and the timestamp indicated he'd received parallel transmissions through both channels. 1. A routine fleet deployment order through official channels. 1. An Obsidian transmission of unknown content, received exactly 3 hours earlier. I pulled up the metadata for both transmissions, not reading content but comparing the routing information, and I saw the pattern with horrible clarity. The official order told Hestan to deploy his battle fleet to the Kairos system to support a compliance action against a hostile native population. The Obsidian transmission, I couldn't read its content, but I could see its origin point had come from a location that wasn't the Time's eternal mandate, asterisk, wasn't any vessel or facility in our fleet, but from somewhere completely different, somewhere that shouldn't have been part of the network at all. I cross-referenced the origin point with my cogitator's navigation database, and what I found made my hands start shaking. The transmission had originated from a vessel designated as hostile in our intelligence reports, part of a rogue fleet that had broken contact with Imperial Command 6 months earlier under circumstances classified as treason and active insurrection. They were enemies, they were traitors, and they were communicating with one of our Lord Admirals through the network I maintained. I sat at my station for a long time, staring at the screen, trying to understand what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Intelligence operations sometimes required contact with hostile forces. Maybe Hestan was a deep cover operative. Maybe the Obsidian network was a counterintelligence operation designed to track traitor movements. Maybe I was seeing one small piece of a larger strategic picture that made perfect sense to people with appropriate clearance. But I couldn't make myself believe it. Not when I looked at the scale of the network, the hundreds of commanders receiving these transmissions, the systematic way the infrastructure had been built. This wasn't counterintelligence. This was coordination. I should have gone to the commissariat immediately. I should have flagged it, reported it, done my duty as a loyal Imperial servant. But I was terrified not of the implications, though those were horrifying enough, but of what would happen to me personally. I'd been maintaining this network for over a year. I'd processed tens of thousands of these transmissions. I'd been personally commended by Lord Marshal Kane for my work on the Obsidian traffic. If this was truly a conspiracy, a betrayal, then I was complicit. I'd helped make it possible, and the commissariat didn't distinguish between willing conspirators and useful idiots who'd been manipulated into service. Both got executed just the same. So I did nothing. I processed the transmission, I routed it correctly, I maintained the network, and I started paying closer attention to the metadata, looking for patterns that might tell me what was really happening. I couldn't read the content that would trigger security alerts that would get me killed, but I could analyze the flow of information, the connections between nodes, the way certain commanders coordinated with each other through the Obsidian network while appearing loyal in official channels. I built a mental map of the infrastructure, not through deliberate investigation but simply through exposure, through processing so many of these transmissions that the patterns became impossible to ignore. What I saw was terrifying in its sophistication. The network had been constructed over years, maybe decades, long before I'd arrived, long before I'd even joined the Departamento Munitorum. Every commander in it had been carefully selected, gradually recruited, systematically integrated into a parallel command structure that existed alongside the official imperial military hierarchy. They held the same ranks, commanded the same forces, followed the same orders from higher authority, but they also maintained these secret channels, these hidden connections, coordinating something that required absolute secrecy from the Imperium they ostensibly served. And the center of it all was Lord Marshal Valdor Kane, the man who'd thanked me personally for my loyal service. I started having nightmares during my off shifts, dreams where I was drowning in transmissions, where data flowed through my brain like poison, where I could hear Kane's voice speaking through every Vox channel in the fleet, warm and reasonable and absolutely wrong. I'd wake in my bunk, sweating, listening to the sounds of the dormitory around me, 40 other clerks and ratings, sleeping peacefully, unaware, ignorant, and I'd wonder if I was losing my mind, if I was seeing conspiracies that didn't exist, if the isolation and monotony of my work had finally broken something in my cognition. But then I'd return to my station, process another 100 Obsidian transmissions, watch the network continue to grow and coordinate, and I'd know it was real. The fourth hook, deployed during a routine fleet assembly, when the evidence became undeniable. The Times' eternal mandate times had returned to a major logistics hub for resupply and crew rotation after a successful compliance campaign in the Voreth sector. The hub was massive, a void station the size of a small moon, where dozens of fleets converged, where supply chains from across the segmentum intersected, where hundreds of thousands of Imperial military and civilian personnel worked to maintain the Crusade's ongoing operations. Our fleet anchored for 3 weeks while we took on provisions, ammunition, replacement personnel, and conducted routine maintenance that couldn't be performed in transit. The Obsidian traffic didn't pause during this period. If anything, it intensified, with transmission volumes spiking to levels that required me to work extended shifts just to keep up with processing. But the destinations changed subtly. Instead of being dispersed across multiple sectors, most of the traffic was now routing to commanders who were physically present at the hub, concentrated in one location for the first time since I'd been monitoring the network. They were meeting. All of them, gathered in one place under the cover of routine fleet operations, coordinating in person while maintaining the fiction of normal military procedure. And the transmission traffic I was seeing was the peripheral communication supporting those meetings, the confirmations and updates and scheduling data that made the coordination possible. I realized, with cold certainty, that whatever they'd been planning was moving into its final phase. You didn't gather this many high-ranking commanders in one location unless you were preparing for something massive, something that required synchronized action across multiple fleets and sectors. And you didn't maintain this level of secrecy unless what you were planning was treason. The word finally crystallized in my mind. Treason. Not counterintelligence, not contingency planning, not any of the comfortable explanations I'd been constructing to avoid confronting what I was really seeing. This was a conspiracy to betray the Imperium, coordinated by some of its highest-ranking military commanders, facilitated by a secret communication network that I'd been maintaining for over a year without understanding what I was doing. And I was guilty. Irredeemably, inescapably guilty. Because even if I reported it now, even if I went to the commissariat with everything I knew, I'd still be complicit in having maintained the network this long. I should have reported the irregular patterns months ago. I should have refused to process the obsidian traffic the first time it appeared in my queue. I should have done my duty as an Imperial servant instead of letting myself be flattered by Kane's recognition, instead of taking pride in being special, chosen, trusted with important work. But I'd done none of those things. And now it was too late. I tried to find Vertain, to ask him if he knew what we were really doing, if he understood the network we maintained. But he wasn't in the archive during his scheduled shifts, and when I asked other senior staff where he'd gone, they told me he'd been reassigned to the Lord Marshal's personal staff, promoted to a position that removed him from day-to-day archive operations. He'd known. Of course he'd known. He'd been part of it all along, carefully managing which clerks received which assignments, ensuring that people like me, efficient, obedient, unquestioning, were the ones maintaining the most sensitive traffic. I started looking for ways to sabotage the network without being detected. Maybe I could introduce routing errors, send transmissions to wrong destinations, corrupt the data in ways that would disrupt the coordination. But the security protocols were too sophisticated. Every transmission I processed was logged, verified, compared against expected patterns by automated systems. Any significant error would trigger alerts that would lead investigators directly to me, and even if I succeeded in disrupting the network, it wouldn't stop what was coming. The conspiracy was too large, too well established, too deeply integrated into Imperial military structure. Destroying the communication network would only blind them temporarily, not prevent them from executing whatever they'd planned. So I did the only thing I could do. I continued working. I processed the transmissions. I maintained the network with perfect efficiency, because anything else would get me killed without accomplishing anything meaningful. The fleet departed the logistics hub after 3 weeks, and we returned to normal operations, or what appeared to be normal operations. But I could see the preparations now, could read the patterns in official traffic that coordinated with the obsidian transmissions I was routing. Fleet deployments that seemed routine but positioned forces in strategic locations. Supply requisitions that exceeded normal operational needs. Personnel transfers that moved loyal officers away from command positions while promoting others who I knew were in the network. Everything was being positioned for something catastrophic. And it was happening so gradually, so carefully disguised as routine military activity, that no one noticed except me, the cipher clerk who'd seen too much, who understood too much, who'd become too specialized in processing the traffic that made it all possible. The fifth and final hook, deployed during my 18th month aboard the Time's Eternal Mandate Asterisk, when I discovered why I'd been chosen. I was called to Lord Marshal Kane's personal quarters, summoned by direct order during my scheduled off-shift. I went with terror coiling in my stomach, certain I'd been discovered, certain this was the end, that I'd be executed for knowing too much, or perhaps recruited fully into the conspiracy because I'd proven my loyalty through continued service. Either way, I was trapped. Either way, I was complicit. Kane received me in his private study, a luxuriously appointed chamber that seemed out of place on a military vessel, filled with personal effects and trophies from his campaigns. He was alone, no guards or staff present, which should have comforted me but instead made me more nervous. If he was going to kill me, he'd do it personally, quickly, and my body would be disposed of without record. "Adept Threnody," he said warmly, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. I wanted to speak with you personally about your exemplary service." I sat, keeping my hands folded in my lap so he wouldn't see them shaking. Thank you, Lord Marshal. You've been maintaining the Obsidian network for 18 months now. Longer than any previous clerk, actually. Most can't handle the cognitive load, the volume of traffic, the classification levels, the security requirements. They burn out after a few months, require replacement. But you've thrived. You've become more efficient, more reliable, more valuable with each passing month. I want to understand why. I simply do my duty, Lord Marshal. No. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. You do more than your duty. You've internalized the network. You understand its structure, its patterns, its significance. I can see it in your processing efficiency, in the way you handle complex routing scenarios without hesitation. You've stopped being a simple conduit and become something more sophisticated, an active component of the infrastructure. Someone who maintains it not just mechanically but with comprehension. My throat was dry. I don't understand the content, Lord Marshal. I only process metadata. But you understand the network. You see the patterns. You know we're coordinating something vast, something that requires this level of secrecy. And you've kept processing the traffic despite knowing this, despite surely understanding that what we're doing operates outside official channels. Why? I didn't know how to answer. Because I was afraid? Because I was complicit? Because I'd been too weak to report what I was seeing? I selected you personally, Kane continued. When I reviewed personnel files for cipher clerks who might be suitable for this assignment, I looked for specific psychological indicators, not loyalty. Loyalty is easy to fake, easy to perform until it's tested. I looked for people who valued recognition over principle, who craved importance more than integrity, who would choose complicity over moral courage if the choice was framed correctly. Your profile suggested you had those qualities. And I was right. The words landed like physical blows. He'd known from the beginning. He'd chosen me specifically because I was the kind of person who would help facilitate treason if it made me feel valued, if it gave me purpose, if it let me believe I was part of something important. I hadn't been corrupted or manipulated. I'd been selected because I was already the kind of person who would serve betrayal without needing to be convinced. The network you've maintained, Kane said, standing and walking to a viewport that showed the void beyond, stars scattered across the darkness, represents years of careful preparation. My predecessor began building it decades ago, recruiting commanders who understood that the Imperium as currently structured is failing, that the Crusade's expansion is unsustainable, that the military hierarchy serves administrative inefficiency rather than strategic necessity. We represent a reformation, a necessary restructuring that will allow humanity to truly thrive, rather than merely survive through increasingly brutal oppression. He was justifying it, making it sound reasonable, strategic, necessary. That's what they all did. I suppose every traitor in history convinced themselves they were the hero, that their betrayal served some higher purpose. And soon, he continued, the network will activate. Every commander in it will receive simultaneous orders to turn against the current command structure, to seize control of their forces and assets, to establish a new military authority that serves humanity's actual interests, rather than the bureaucratic incompetence that currently governs the Imperium. Half the Crusade will turn in a single coordinated action, and the other half won't understand what's happening until it's too late to resist effectively. It will be the largest military coup in human history, executed with such precision that it will appear inevitable in retrospect. That's treason, I said quietly, finally speaking the word aloud. That's evolution, Kane corrected. The Imperium's current structure is doomed. We're either the architects of its replacement, or we're accomplices to its inevitable collapse. I prefer the former. And me? What happens to me when this activation occurs? You continue doing what you've been doing, maintaining the network, processing the traffic, keeping the communication infrastructure functional. You've proven yourself too valuable to discard. Adept Threnody. You'll serve the new authority just as faithfully as you've served the old, Because service is what you do, it's who you are. He was right. I hated that he was right, but I couldn't deny it. I'd already proven I would maintain this network, despite knowing it facilitated treason. What made me think I'd suddenly develop the courage to resist once the coup actually occurred? I'd keep processing transmissions, keep routing traffic, keep maintaining the infrastructure because that's what I'd always done. Because changing course would require strength I'd already demonstrated I didn't possess. When? I asked. When does it happen? Soon. The timing depends on factors beyond your clearance level. But soon, and when it does, you'll be one of the few who understands how it was possible. How we turned half the Imperium, without anyone noticing, until it was too late. You'll know that you made it possible. That your efficient service, your unquestioning loyalty to your assigned duties, your desperate need to feel valued, all of that made you the perfect instrument for betrayal. He dismissed me then, sending me back to the communications archive where my queue was overflowing with obsidian transmissions that needed processing. And I did process them, because what else could I do? I maintained the network. I kept the traffic flowing. I facilitated the coup even now, even knowing exactly what I was doing, because Cain had been right about me from the beginning. I was the kind of person who would help betray everything I'd ever believed in if it made me feel important. The activation occurred 3 weeks later, during a routine transit between compliance operations. Simultaneously, across 30 sectors, hundreds of commanders received their final orders through the Obsidian network. Fleet elements turned on each other, engaging sister vessels with coordinated precision. Garrison commanders seized planetary governors. Army groups declared independence from imperial command structure. Supply chains that had supported the crusade for decades were suddenly redirected to support the rebel forces. Administrative officials who'd spent their careers processing imperial bureaucracy suddenly switched allegiance to a new authority. Half the Imperium turned in less than 6 hours, and the other half was caught completely unprepared because no one had noticed the network being built, the infrastructure being established, the conspiracy spreading through their own ranks. How could they notice? Everything had appeared legitimate. All the proper authorization codes, all the correct clearances, all the requisite seals and signatures, just like I'd verified thousands of times, processing traffic that I told myself must be legitimate because it bore all the markers of legitimacy. The Time's eternal mandate times survived the initial chaos because Cain commanded it directly, and most of our crew had already been recruited into the conspiracy or were too confused to resist effectively. But the fleet around us dissolved into violent conflict as loyalist vessels engaged traitors, as commanders discovered their subordinates had turned against them, or vice versa, as the careful network Cain had built translated from hidden coordination into open warfare. I continued working through it all. In the communications archive, insulated from the physical violence occurring throughout the fleet, I processed transmissions with the same efficiency I'd always maintained. Except now the Obsidian network was the official network. Now the rebel forces were the legitimate command structure. Now my service supported the new authority instead of the old. Nothing had changed except the designation of who was loyal and who was traitor. And I served both with equal dedication, because that's what I did. That's who I was. The war lasted 6 years. The Imperium eventually recovered, marshalling its vast resources to suppress the rebellion, but the cost was catastrophic. Entire fleet elements destroyed, whole sectors depopulated by the fighting, billions dead, infrastructure devastated, decades of crusade progress reversed, and it had all been possible because of the network, because of the careful coordination that had let the traitors turn simultaneously, because of cipher clerks like me who'd maintained the infrastructure without questioning what we were really doing. When the Loyalists finally retook the Time's eternal mandate *, I was one of the few original crew still alive. Most had died in the fighting, but I'd survived in the communications archive, continuing to process traffic for whichever authority currently controlled the vessel, switching allegiance whenever the ship changed hands, serving with equal efficiency regardless of which side I was technically supporting. The commissariat interrogated me for weeks, trying to determine if I'd been a willing conspirator or merely a useful tool. I told them everything about Kane, about the network, about how I'd known and continued serving anyway, because I was afraid and complicit and too weak to resist. They should have executed me. I was guilty of treason by any reasonable definition, guilty of facilitating the largest military coup in imperial history, guilty of maintaining the infrastructure that had killed billions. But they didn't execute me because I was also valuable, because I understood the network better than anyone except Kane himself, because I could help them identify remaining traitor cells that were still using fragments of the communication infrastructure I'd maintained. So they kept me alive. They made me serve the Imperium again, processing transmissions for the commissariat's counterintelligence operations, helping them root out conspirators who'd escaped initial suppression, using my knowledge of the network to destroy what remained of it. And I did that work with the same efficiency I'd brought to serving Kane, because service was what I did, because I'd proven I could betray anyone if the alternative was taking responsibility for my own choices. I'm old now. 40 years have passed since the rebellion ended, and I'm still processing transmissions, still maintaining networks, still serving as a cipher clerk in the Departamento Munitorum, because that's all I know how to do. The commissariat never trusted me enough to let me leave communications work, never released me from surveillance, never let me forget what I'd done, and I carry the knowledge every day that I helped turn half the Imperium, that I made the betrayal possible through my efficient service and desperate need to feel valued, that Kane had been right about me from the very beginning. This is my confession, recorded for anyone who might wonder how it was possible, how such a vast conspiracy could operate without detection, how someone could turn half the Imperium in secret. The answer is simple, terrifyingly simple. You recruit people who value recognition over principle. You give them work that makes them feel important. You build your network using the Imperium's own infrastructure, using proper authorization codes and correct clearances, so everything appears legitimate. And you rely on the fact that most people, when faced with evidence of wrongdoing, will choose complicity over courage if the personal cost of resistance seems too high. I was one of those people. I saw the network, understood what it meant, and kept serving it anyway because I was afraid and weak and desperate to believe I was valuable. And there were thousands like me throughout the conspiracy, clerks and administrators and logistics officers and functionaries who processed the traffic, maintained the infrastructure, facilitated the coordination. All of us telling ourselves we were just doing our jobs, just following proper procedure, just serving loyally, even as we helped build the mechanism for the Imperium's betrayal. That's how Kane turned half the Imperium in secret. Not through force or open rebellion, but through careful recruitment of people like me, people who would serve betrayal as efficiently as they'd serve loyalty, if you just gave them the proper authorization codes and made them feel important while they did it. I am Adept Secundus Cale Threnody. I helped facilitate the largest military coup in Imperial history, and I'm still serving, still processing transmissions, still maintaining networks, because that's what I am, a conduit, a tool, a perfect instrument for whatever authority currently commands me. The Imperium kept me alive because I'm useful, because someone who can betray everything for the illusion of importance is exactly the kind of servant that humanity's vast bureaucratic machinery needs. I am the reason the betrayal succeeded, and I continue serving because I've never been anything else.